Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, my little corner on the internet. I hope you're all doing well. Today's book has been on my list for a long time, and that is Anne of Green Gables. Quite fitting for the season, I would say. It was written by Canadian author Lucy Maud Montgomery and first published in 1908. So without further ado, why don't you make yourself comfortable with some tea, cookies, or any other refreshment of your choice, and let's get into it. Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert were two siblings living together on their family's farm called Green Gables. They had been running things just fine over the years, but now they had decided to adopt a boy to help out on the farm. So they sent word through a connection they had to an orphanage, and Matthew set off to pick up the boy from the train station. Matthew was an introverted man who spent pretty much all his time on the farm. He never married, as women kind of terrified him. So imagine his surprise and general shock when he found a girl waiting for him at the train station, and not a boy. Matthew was too shy to tell the starry-eyed, red-headed girl that there had been some mistake, so he took her home. His sister Marilla would have to be the breaker of bad news. And the ride home was interesting, to say the least. The girl talked constantly. She held long monologues about everything that they passed, occasionally asking questions that Matthew didn't know how to answer, and was in general mesmerized by the spring landscapes they passed on the way to Green Gables. When they arrived, Marilla was very quick to reveal that they were not, in fact, expecting a girl. The little girl was devastated, and when Marilla asked for her name, she said that she preferred to be called Cordelia, which started a bit of back and forth with Marilla before she finally revealed that her name was Anne. Anne, but with an E, that was important. So the devastated Anne is sent to bed. Marilla had decided to take her back herself the next day and rectify the mistake that had been made. But Matthew, however, did not agree. He told his sister that he'd like to keep her. He enjoyed her sweet innocence and overall chattiness. Marilla wasn't as easily convinced though, so the next day she and Anne went with the carriage towards the lady that had sent her there. On the road, Marilla asked Anne about her past, and we learned that her parents had been teachers. She was 11, and she had been orphaned at only 3 months old when both of her parents died from a fever. After that, she had been passed around between several families who had taken her in only to have help with their own children, and then eventually ended up in an orphanage. And Marilla realized what an unfortunate childhood she had lived and felt sympathy for her. So they arrived at Mrs. Spencer's, and Marilla explained the mistake. Mrs. Spencer apologized and said that Anne could just go and live with Mrs. Blewett, as she was in need of a girl to help with her large family. Marilla didn't like the sound of this, as she had heard of Mrs. Blewett and she wasn't a kind woman. Anne gave Marilla a pleading look, and that settled it. So Marilla took Anne home with her again. Anne was ecstatic. She tried her best to please Marilla, which wasn't the easiest, as she was already a stern woman, and Anne was prone to daydreaming, which made her mess up a lot of her tasks. 2 weeks had gone by when Anne finally got to meet Mrs. Lynde, who was Marilla's friend. She was also the town gossip, and quite blunt in her opinions, which didn't exactly make matters easier. As soon as she saw Anne, she made some rude remarks about her looks, in particular her skinny figure and red hair. And Anne flew into a rage. She called her fat, it was all quite dramatic, and Mrs. Lynde stormed out of there as fast as her legs could carry her. Marilla then gave her the old, "I'm not angry, I'm disappointed" talk, but it wouldn't do. Anne refused to apologize and was thus confined to her room. In the end, it was Matthew who snuck up there and managed to convince Anne to apologize. They kept this a secret from Marilla, and for years she was under the impression that her room arrest tactic was the best way to make Anne behave. As Anne was now a permanent resident with the Cuthberts, Marilla decided to give her some new clothes. She made her 3 dresses, all of which were very practical, no frills or puffed sleeves or anything like that. But Anne had always dreamed of having puffed sleeves. It was the latest fashion, all the girls had it. Marilla pointed out how ridiculous puffed sleeves were, but Anne replied, "But I'd rather look ridiculous when everybody else does than plain and sensible all by myself." Which, I mean, true. So when Anne finally attended her first Sunday school, she naturally found it miserable, as everyone there wore puffed sleeves except for her. It was now well into the summer, and the neighboring family had just returned home. They had a daughter named Diana who was the same age as Anne, so Marilla brought her there to introduce the girls. Anne and Diana hit it off immediately, and within minutes of their introduction, they made a vow in the garden to be bosom friends forever. They made playdates and went on to spend all of their free time together. One day, the Sunday school announced the annual summer picnic, and Anne was beside herself with excitement. She had never been to a picnic before. All she could talk about, think about, and dream about was the upcoming picnic. But then Marilla realizes that her amethyst brooch is gone. She asks Anne about it, and Anne admits that she had tried it on because it was so pretty, but she was sure that she put it back. Now, Marilla knows that Anne can be a bit aloof, so she doesn't believe her. But Anne keeps insisting, so Marilla sent her to her room. She would not be allowed to come out until she had confessed that she had lost the brooch. But the picnic was coming up, and Anne was not about to miss that. So she confessed. She told a story that she had brought the brooch when she was playing outside with Diana and it got lost. And Marilla decided to punish her for this by not letting her go to the picnic, and Anne was devastated. But then Marilla finds the brooch in her own trunk. It was stuck to a shawl and had thus got into the trunk by mistake. So she apologized to Anne and asked her why she had lied and said it got lost. To which Anne replied that Marilla didn't believe her when she had told the truth, so she would rather confess to a fault she did not commit than miss the Sunday school picnic. Thankfully for Anne, it was still not too late, and she managed to make it just in time for the picnic. September arrived, and with that, Anne started school along with the other children of Avonlea. She already knew the other girls from Sunday school, and she was bosom friends forever with Diana, so she had no trouble fitting in, apart from not having any puffed sleeves, of course. But a few weeks in, a boy who had been away returned to the school. His name was Gilbert Blythe. Blythe. I'm going to struggle with his name for this whole video. He was 14 years old and quite the handsome boy. He enjoyed teasing all the girls in the class, and Anne was soon to experience the same treatment. He tried getting her attention, and when she ignored him, he made the fateful mistake of calling her carrots, referring to her bright red hair. Now, Anne's hair color was her deepest insecurity, along with the freckles, skinny figure, and non-fashionable clothing, but it was mostly the hair. So she hit him, and the teacher punished her by making her stand by the blackboard for the rest of the day with the words, "Anne Shirley must learn to control her temper." The next day she was punished even further by being ripped from her friend Diana and made to sit next to Gilbert. Now this was a step too far. So Anne picked up her things at the end of the day and went home to Green Gables without any intention of returning. Luckily for her, Marilla had no objection, since she thought it improper for a teacher to make a girl sit next to a boy, so it was decided. October arrived, and Anne was to have Diana over for tea. Now, Matthew was out working on the farm, and Marilla was on an errand, so the girls were all alone. Before leaving, Marilla told Anne that they could have the last of the raspberry cordial, which is a kind of sweet fruit drink, and Anne served it to her friend with pride. Now, Diana really liked the raspberry cordial and had 3 big glasses of it, but then she started feeling unwell. She became dizzy and had to go home, which was a disappointment to Anne, who had planned all sorts of cakes and things for their tea time. 2 days later, Marilla sends Anne over to Mrs. Lynde on an errand. There, Anne learned the terrible news. Diana's mother, Mrs. Barry, was reportedly furious that Anne had got Diana drunk, and now she won't let Diana see Anne anymore. So Anne ran home in despair and told Marilla, who then realized that she had moved the raspberry cordial to the cellar. The red drink that the girls had taken from the pantry was her homemade currant wine. Feeling somewhat responsible for this mishap, Marilla went over to the Barrys' farm to explain, but Mrs. Barry didn't believe that it was an accident and went on to shame Marilla for making homemade currant wine in the first place. So Marilla marched home fuming with anger. Anne then went over and tried to apologize, but was met with equal coldness. The following day, Diana went over to say goodbye, as she was not allowed to talk to Anne again. After this, Anne made the decision to return to school, as that would be the only place where she could see her dear bosom friend. Diana was still not allowed to talk to her, even at school, but they could communicate through looks. Anne went on to dedicate herself to her studies and didn't cause any more trouble with the teacher. She still refused to speak to Gilbert Blythe, and they became academic rivals, always going head to head in spelling or mathematics. And by the end of the term, she had been promoted to 5th grade. There was an important political event in a neighboring town, and many adults of Avonlea went there to attend and were thus gone overnight. So Anne is at home with Matthew when Diana runs over there in complete panic. Her 3-year-old sister, Minnie May, had got croup, a very dangerous illness causing breathing difficulties. And her parents weren't home and she had no idea what to do. Anne, however, had experience dealing with the croup, as she had tended to many children with the affliction. So Matthew drove off to find a doctor while Anne went with Diana. And thanks to Anne's experience, Minnie May was saved and survived the night. And when the doctor finally arrived, he could confirm that she was out of danger. He later went on to tell Mrs. Barry everything, and she felt immense gratitude and forgave Anne for accidentally getting Diana drunk that one time. So they were finally allowed to be friends again. Time went on and it was now June. Their teacher had left the school and a temporary teacher had taken the position. Mrs. Allen was her name, and she was the wife of the new local minister. Anne was immediately taken by her grace and deemed her a kindred spirit, as she was prone to do with people she liked. So when Marilla announced that they would be having the minister and his wife over for tea, Anne was beside herself with excitement and asked if she could bake them a special cake. And when the time came to serve her cake, Mrs. Allen made a strange face as she was tasting it. It was then revealed that Anne had, in her excitement, accidentally picked up a bottle of liniment instead of vanilla flavoring, meaning the cake tasted like medicine. Needless to say, Anne was very embarrassed. A little while later, Diana hosted a party, and during that party they played a game of daring. No truths, only dares. And Anne was dared into walking the ridge on top of the kitchen roof. Sadly, she fell off and broke her ankle and was in bed for many weeks, meaning that she missed the arrival of the new teacher, Miss Stacy. But all her friends visited her frequently and kept her updated on things, so it wasn't all bad. In October, Anne was finally healed and could return to school. And she loved Miss Stacy right away and felt instinctively that Miss Stacy spelled Anne with an E, so they must be kindred spirits. And she wore pretty puffed sleeves. Very important detail. One day in December, Matthew ran into Anne and her friends as they were rehearsing for their Christmas concert in the sitting room. They were so occupied that they didn't notice him come in, and he prayed silently that they wouldn't see him, as then he'd be forced to interact. As he was watching them, however, he noticed that there was something distinctly different about Anne compared to the others. What could it be? He pondered over this all evening, smoking his pipe, until eventually he figured it out. It was the sleeves. She wasn't dressed like the others. Surely it would be all right to let the girl have one fashionable dress. Matthew just warms my heart. So Matthew goes to a store, hoping to find a male clerk, but alas, it was a woman. He got so rattled that he ended up asking for garden rakes instead, a peculiar request for December. In his second attempt, he asked for hayseed, which again wasn't available until spring. In one last attempt to gather himself, he tried once more, but ended up buying 2 pounds of brown sugar instead, which puzzled Marilla when he got home. Knowing that it wasn't possible for him to commission the dress himself, he asked the neighbor, Mrs. Lynde, for help, which she was more than happy to give. She was thrilled that Anne would be wearing something fashionable for once, and couldn't understand why Marilla insisted on her wearing boring practical dresses. Christmas morning came and Matthew presented the dress to Anne, who was overjoyed to the point of tears. She was finally to wear puffed sleeves, just like all the other girls. They did their Christmas concert later and Anne did a brilliant performance. Matthew told her afterwards that he was proud of her, and Marilla admitted to him that she was proud too, but wouldn't tell Anne so. It might go to her head. As Anne and Diana were walking home after the concert, Diana implored Anne to forgive Gilbert. She said that she had seen him pick up a flower that had fallen from Anne's hair, and he had put it in his breast pocket. But Anne was obstinate. She would not forgive him. It was now spring, and Anne had turned 13 years old. As Marilla was on her way home one day from a meeting, she looked forward to arriving to a cooked dinner and warm fire, as it was Anne's duty to do this while she was away. But alas, when she got home, she found a cold hearth and no dinner. So she set to work herself, and once a hungry Matthew returned from the farm, he had to listen to her rant about how naughty Anne was for forgetting her duties. Later, she went upstairs and found Anne in her bed. She checked on her, thinking that she was ill, but no, she was in the depths of despair. A traveling merchant had stopped by that day, and she had bought hair dye from him, hoping that it would turn her hair black. But instead, it had turned green, or greenish. Marilla, of course, scolded her for her vanity and tried her best to wash it off, but it was no use. They had no choice but to cut off her hair entirely. Poor Anne had now realized the hard way that having red hair wasn't so bad after all, considering the alternative. Sometime after this, Anne and her friends were playing outside, and as they decided what characters to play, Anne got the one that was supposed to float on a raft sort of thing down the stream. She was the bravest of the bunch, after all. Anne agreed, and as she was floating down the stream, her friends ran away to meet her further down. But that's when she realized that something was wrong. There was a leak somewhere, and she was sinking. She managed to grab hold of a pole in the water, hoping that her friends would find her soon so that they could get help. And who would come rowing down the stream right at that moment? Well, her arch-nemesis, Gilbert Blythe. She allowed him to save her, of course, and once she was safe back on dry land, Gilbert asked if she would forgive him. He wanted to become friends, but Anne was still holding a grudge and refused his request. So he turned away in a sour mood and she walked off towards her friend, feeling a sting of remorse. Later, Marilla asked her, "Will you ever have any sense, Anne?" To which she replied, "Oh yes, as each mistake had taught her a valuable lesson. The hair dye incident taught her not to be vain, the liniment cake taught her not to be careless in her cooking, and so forth," which is rather wise, I must say. Just a little bit more time passed, and Anne continued her academic rivalry with Gilbert. Her teacher had now created an extra class after school for students who wanted to move on to Queen's Academy the following year to study for their teacher's license. Anne and Gilbert were part of this class, as well as a few others, but not Diana. This kept her quite busy during the next school year, and then it was finally spring again and time for the entrance exam. Anne had now turned 15 years old, and she was now taller than Marilla. And Marilla was making her fashionable clothes now, as she couldn't bear the thought of Matthew asking Mrs. Lynde for help with this again. Another thing she couldn't bear was the thought of Anne leaving them. She even had a sentimental moment when she told Matthew how much she would miss her. She wouldn't tell Anne though, just Matthew. Then it was exam time. Anne stayed with Diana's great-aunt Josephine in the city during the examinations, whom she had grown close to over the years. She was horribly nervous about the exams, and when she saw Gilbert, she felt regret over not having accepted his friendship when he offered it, as it would have felt better having his support. After the exams, Anne is then back home in Avonlea and waiting not so patiently for the results. 3 weeks passed and she was beside herself with worry. But then Diana came running with newspaper in hand. The pass list had been released. And Anne had not only passed, she was tied with Gilbert in first place out of 200 students. And everyone was super proud of her. After the summer vacation, it was then time for Anne to move to the city for her enrollment in the Queen's Academy. Marilla gets sentimental and thinks of the little girl that they took in and how fast she had grown up. Everything was prepared for her departure, and Marilla even commissioned an evening dress for her in case she was invited to a formal event. Which was really sweet, as it was usually Matthew who spoiled Anne with pretty gifts. Anne then had some tearful goodbyes with the Cuthberts and Diana, and then she was off. Her first day there, she had felt the solitude, but she quickly threw herself into her studies. She had Gilbert in her class, so their rivalry could continue. They had both signed up for finishing the full program in 1 year instead of 2, so their workload was doubled. The months went by with the students spending the weekdays at school and the weekends at home in Avonlea. Anne definitely regretted not having accepted Gilbert's friendship, especially as she saw him walking and talking with the other students. Their rivalry had also taken on a new air. She no longer wanted to win for the sake of beating him, but for the pride of having beaten a worthy opponent. Anne continued studying hard over the spring term until it was time for the end-of-year examinations. There was a lot at stake here. Not only would Anne be a licensed teacher if she passed, there was also a medal for the highest performing student and a chance to win a scholarship to attend college. After the exams were over, Anne and her girl group walked towards the bulletin board at the school to see the results. As they got closer, she saw Gilbert being carried around by the other boys, congratulating him on winning the medal. Anne's heart sank. She had failed and Gilbert had won. She would be such a disappointment to Matthew, who had so firmly believed in her. But then people started coming up to her and congratulating her. She had been the winner of the scholarship. After the commencement, where Anne had read an essay and Matthew and Marilla had watched her proudly in the audience, it was time to return home for the summer. She reunited with her bosom friend Diana, who told her that Gilbert would not be going to college next year, as his father couldn't afford it. Instead, he was to study from home while taking the new teaching position at the Avonlea school. Anne was stunned. What about their rivalry? She wouldn't know how to succeed without it, having had that to motivate her the last 5 years. But Anne soon got other things to worry about. Both Matthew and Marilla were not doing great. Matthew had issues with his heart, and Marilla's migraines were getting more frequent. On top of that, the bank where they had all of their money was rumored to be failing as well. Anne came up to Matthew one day as he was letting out the cows, telling him to go back home and rest. But he waved it off, saying he was just getting old. And they have a sweet moment where he tells her just how proud he is of her. And a few days later, Matthew stood at the threshold with the newspaper and fell to the ground unconscious. Anne and Marilla ran to his side, but there was nothing they could do. He had had a heart attack and died instantly. The shock that had caused it was in the newspaper in his hand. Their bank had declared bankruptcy. All of their money was gone. Anne and Marilla came together in their grief. Marilla wouldn't have known what to do if it wasn't for Anne. And Anne felt like Marilla was the only one who could understand her immense loss. Anne went on to plant a rose bush by Matthew's grave, and it was the same roses that his mother had once brought with her from Scotland, and he had always been very fond of them. One evening, Marilla tells Anne that she has a doctor's appointment the next day, and asks if she can take care of the chores while she is away. Anne reassured her that there's no need to worry about her putting liniment in the cake anymore. And they go on to have a moment reminiscing over the past scrapes Anne got herself into. Marilla then says that Gilbert Blythe has grown into a fine young man. She told her that she was close with his father when they were young, and people even called him her beau. But then they had quarreled over something and became estranged. The next day, Marilla returned from the doctor's with troubling news. She had to give up all work that was straining for the eyes, otherwise she'd go blind within 6 months. It's just one tragedy after the other. Not long after this, a gentleman called at Green Gables, asking if they'd be interested in selling it. Marilla couldn't see what else to do, but Anne disapproved. She had made the decision to not move to college. She would study from home and apply for a teacher's position somewhere in town so that she could stay with Marilla. She had also heard from Mr. Barry, Diana's father, about possibly renting their farm. Marilla didn't want her to give up her plans for her sake, but Anne says that she is 16 and a half now and obstinate as a mule, so she won't change her mind. So it was settled, and Marilla felt like Anne had given her a second chance at life. Now, Anne's decision had caused a bit of gossip in Avonlea. Mrs. Lynde came over, saying that Gilbert had decided to give up his teaching position at the Avonlea school and told the trustees to give it to Anne instead. That evening, after Anne had visited Matthew's grave and watered his rosebush, she ran into Gilbert on the way home. She stopped him and addressed him with reddening cheeks, thanking him for the kind gesture. They shook hands, and he asked if they could be friends now. She replied that she had forgiven him that day when he had saved her from the stream, although she didn't know it at the time. He then walked her home, and they stood chatting at the gate for half an hour before she went inside. That night, Anne thought of how her prospects had changed since coming home for the summer. But she would still have the joy of friendship, aspiration, and work, as well as her dreams. So everything was all right after all. The end. Oh my goodness, it was so difficult to get through that last part without tearing up. I think I cried my way through the last 3 chapters when reading. But yes, that was Anne of Green Gables, which is the first book in a series of 8. I'd like to start by saying what a delightful read this was. I wasn't quite sure what to expect, so I thought it would be a bit like The Secret Garden meets Little Women. But I ended up enjoying this so much more than those two combined. I thought this was a really endearing and wholesome read, and I would definitely recommend it even if you've listened to this video. There are so many details in it that I couldn't include or simply couldn't do justice in this runtime. So yes, I loved it, and my main reason for that is of course the relationship between Anne, Matthew and Marilla. Now, Matthew liked Anne from the start. She was such a chatterbox, which was disarming for an introvert like Matthew. He wasn't a big talker himself, but he enjoyed listening, and he found her lively spirit refreshing. It was obvious how his character had gone through his whole life missing something, which then made it easier for him to accept and want to keep Anne, even from the first night. Marilla, on the other hand, wasn't as quick as her brother. Being the more practical and strict of the two, she was set on them needing a boy to help with the farm. And even when she decided to keep Anne, it was mainly out of pity, since she knew what awaited her if she let Anne go with Mrs. Blewett. From then on, her love for Anne would increase in subtle ways. Like when Anne took her hand as they were walking home one day, or when Anne said something that wasn't supposed to be funny, but Marilla found herself laughing at it. And eventually she realized how much this child had come to mean to her. Come here. Come up here. Oh, yeah. Oh. So yeah, the dynamic was always quite clear. Marilla was the enforcer of rules and punishments who never really encouraged her, whereas Matthew was the one giving praise and presents, but very little in terms of discipline. Together, they provided a balance in nurturing that helped Anne grow up and develop into the remarkable young woman that she was at the end of the book. And then we have my second favorite thing, which is that of wholesome female friendships. Anne and Diana are just wonderful. There's no drama, selfishness, or backstabbing, only love and support. They would praise and compliment each other all the time, like after a performance at the school, things like that, which is just so lovely and heartwarming. Even something like jealousy or envy was done in a way that feels natural. Like Anne feeling envious of Diana's good looks, but instead of harboring resentment, she just admires her. Or Diana feeling a bit of jealousy about Anne's new close friend at Queen's Academy, which is then resolved immediately as Anne says that Diana is still her one and only bosom friend. Bosom friend forever. So yes, wonderful book, would highly recommend. Now I'd like to know your thoughts and feelings, so please share those in the comments below. And don't forget to give the video a like if you enjoyed it, as that is super helpful to me. It lets YouTube know that my video is worth watching and they will share it with more people. Thank you all so much for watching today, and I hope to see you back next time. And so does Nance. Yeah, he does.